The moment that changed everything didn't look dramatic. No screams, no crowd. Just a man standing still, hands dirty from work, choosing not to walk away. No one noticed him stop. No one thanked him for it. But sometimes, history doesn't begin with a loud decision. It begins with a quiet one when someone finally says, "I won't pretend I didn't see this." And once that choice is made, there's no going back. If this kind of story speaks to you, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories that stay with you. Samuel Crow had learned how to keep his head down. He lived where the land stayed dry most of the year, where wind carried more dust than voices, a place where men worked quietly, finished their days, and didn't ask questions that had no safe answers. Samuel had been one of them. He woke before dawn, fixed what was broken, ate when the sun told him to, slept when the cold crept in. Nothing about his life drew attention, and that was exactly how he'd arranged it. Years earlier, he had seen something he shouldn't have ignored. Not a crime you could point to with a finger, just a wrong that sat there, breathing, waiting for someone to say no. He didn't, not because he agreed, not because he was cruel, but because silence felt safer than standing alone. Most people like to believe that only bad men cause harm, that evil has a face, a temper, a reason. But the truth is quieter than that. Harm often survives because ordinary people decide not to get involved. Samuel told himself what many people tell themselves. It's not my place. I don't have all the facts. Speaking up won't change anything. And day by day, those thoughts settled in. Not heavy, just enough to carry. Time passed. The land changed hands. Faces came and went. The wrong never disappeared. It just learned how to live underground. Silence has a strange way of doing that. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It simply waits. In the mind, silence begins to feel neutral, like nothing. But it isn't nothing. It's a choice made over and over again. And the longer it's made, the harder it becomes to undo. Samuel never thought of himself as guilty, but he didn't think of himself as clean either. Some nights, when the wind pressed against the walls and the dark stretched on longer than it should, he'd reach for his pocket watch, open it, close it, count the seconds, as if time itself could be kept from asking questions. He wasn't running. He was staying exactly where he was. And that, in its own way, was the problem. People like Samuel exist everywhere. Not villains, not heroes. Just witnesses who survive by blending into the background. They don't create the fire. They just don't throw water on it when it starts. And society makes room for them, encourages them, even calls it practicality, calls it minding your own business. But the mind never forgets what the mouth refused to say. That's how moral debt forms. Quietly, without paperwork, without punishment. Just a weight that shifts every time a similar moment appears. Samuel didn't know who would carry that weight next. He only knew he'd been carrying it longer than he wanted to admit. And when the moment came that looked too familiar to ignore, the question wasn't whether he was brave. It was whether he could live with choosing silence one more time. So before we go any further, ask yourself something. Not what you would do in a perfect world. Not what sounds right when other people are listening. But this. How many times have you seen something wrong and told yourself staying quiet was the safer choice? And what has that silence cost you? Since then, Elena Ward didn't arrive like someone waiting to be saved. She came the way consequences do. Quietly. Already shaped by decisions made long before she had any say in them. She didn't ask many questions. Didn't explain herself. She stood where she was told to stand, sat where there was space, watched more than she spoke. Her eyes held the kind of distance that doesn't come from travel, but from learning not to expect much. Samuel noticed that first. Not the bruises, not the exhaustion. The way she waited, even when no one told her to. Days passed. Morning came with wind scraping against metal. Samuel checked the perimeter, counted the locks, fixed a hinge that never stayed straight. He didn't announce what he was doing. He just did it. At noon, he left a plate on the table, stepped back, didn't watch her eat. At night, he lit the lamp, turned it low, sat with his pocket watch open in his palm, listening to the building settle. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. Elena began to notice the pattern before she noticed the kindness. The same footsteps at dawn, the same pause before a door was closed, the same chair left empty, never taken from her. No speeches, no promises, just repetition. People often think change comes from one big moment, a confession, a rescue, a decision shouted loud enough for the world to hear. But that's not how it usually works. Change sneaks in through routine, through the things done when no one is watching, through the actions that feel too small to matter, so they're repeated without ceremony. Samuel didn't heal Elena by doing something heroic. He healed her by being predictable. And when someone has lived inside chaos long enough, predictability feels like mercy. Each day she woke up and the room was still there. The door still locked the same way. The lamp still lit at the same hour. Her body didn't relax all at once. It didn't trust that quickly. But something else shifted. She stopped flinching at footsteps, stopped counting exits, stopped bracing for the moment things would turn. Not because she believed in him, but because the pattern held. Over and over again. That's the part people rarely talk about. A single kind act can feel generous, but it doesn't rewrite a life. What rewrites a life is being remembered more than once, 3 times a day. Not because it was symbolic, but because it was consistent. Morning, noon, night. Care. Repeated until the body learns a new truth before the mind does. History doesn't turn when someone does the right thing once. It turns when someone keeps doing it long after the moment has passed. That's when identity changes. Samuel felt it too. Each repeated action pulled him further away from the man who once stayed quiet. The man who convinced himself that silence was neutral. Every lock he checked, every repair he finished, every meal he shared without claiming credit. These weren't gestures. They were choices that added up. Slowly, the space between who he had been and who he was becoming grew wider. Too wide to step back across unnoticed. And that's the danger of small, repeated decisions. They don't feel like turning points while you're making them. But one day, you look back and realize the road behind you no longer leads where it used to. Elena didn't thank him. Samuel didn't expect it. Gratitude wasn't the currency here. Trust was. And trust doesn't arrive in a rush. It forms the way stone does, under pressure, over time, through repetition. By the time either of them understood what was changing, it had already begun. Not loudly, not all at once, just quietly enough that no one thought to ask about it. Which makes you wonder, how many lives are shaped not by what happens to them, but by what someone chooses to do again tomorrow. What if Samuel Crowe had never stopped that day? Not because he was heartless, not because he agreed with what was happening, just because he was tired, because the sun was already low, because he told himself it wasn't his problem. In that version of the story, nothing dramatic happens. He finishes his work. dusts off his hands, locks the gate the same way he always has. Elena doesn't follow him inside. She doesn't speak up. She fades back into the place she came from, where people learn how to disappear without leaving a mark. The town stays quiet. Men gather at the end of the day, talk about weather, complain about broken equipment and slow years. No one mentions what they saw. No one asks where she went. Life goes on, and from the outside, everything looks fine. Samuel keeps his land, keeps his routine, keeps the reputation of being a man who never caused trouble. But something changes anyway. It always does. At night, the wind still moves through the same cracks. The building still settles the same way, but the silence feels heavier. He washes his hands at the basin and pauses longer than usual. The water runs clear. Too clear. Somewhere inside him, a moment replays without sound. A look that asked for nothing, but needed everything. He tells himself the same things people have told themselves for generations. Someone else will help. It's too late now. Getting involved only makes things worse. And for a while, those words work. That's the danger of silence. It rewards you immediately. No conflict, no risk, no one pointing a finger. But it charges interest. Days pass, then weeks. The land doesn't punish him. The town doesn't turn against him. Nothing bad happens, which almost makes it worse. Because now, he has to live with the fact that doing nothing cost him nothing at all, except sleep, except the way his chest tightens when he hears footsteps behind him, except the way his pocket watch feels heavier each night, like time itself is asking a question he refuses to answer. In this version of the story, Elena survives without him, or maybe she doesn't. Samuel never finds out, and that uncertainty becomes its own kind of sentence. People often think the worst regret comes from making the wrong choice. It doesn't. The deepest regret comes from realizing you chose comfort over conscience, and the world didn't stop you. No punishment, no correction, just a quiet agreement to keep going as if nothing happened. Samuel would still be seen as a decent man. That's the part no one likes to admit. Society is very good at forgiving silence. It calls it caution, calls it realism. But the mind keeps its own records. Every time a similar moment appears, the body remembers. The chance to step forward, the choice not to. And each time, the distance between who you are and who you could have been grows a little wider. Not enough to notice at first, just enough to feel. So here's the uncomfortable truth. If Samuel hadn't stopped, the story wouldn't have ended in flames or blood. It would have ended in routine. And that kind of ending is the hardest to escape, because nothing forces you to change. Nothing forces you to face yourself. You just keep living. Until one day, you realize the person you've become is built entirely out of moments when you chose not to stop. So ask yourself this. Not what you would do if the stakes were obvious. Not what you would do if someone was watching. But this. If you had kept walking that day, would you still recognize yourself now? The truth didn't come out all at once. There was no shouting, no one pounding a table, no moment where the room went silent in shock. It surfaced the way old things do. Slowly. When there was finally nowhere left to hide it. Samuel stood alone in the storage room, the air thick with dust and oil. A single bulb hummed overhead. He reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a folded document, its edges soft from being handled too many times. His name was there, signed cleanly, clearly, without hesitation. Years ago, when the mine collapsed and everything was uncertain, the town had moved fast. Papers passed hands, Decisions were made behind closed doors, ownership redefined, responsibility buried under necessity. Samuel had told himself it was temporary, that it was paperwork, nothing more, that someone else would fix it later. But paperwork has weight, and ink doesn't fade just because time passes. Elena didn't ask to see the document. She didn't need to. She recognized the truth the moment Samuel stopped speaking. There was no accusation in her eyes, no demand, just recognition. The kind that says, "I already knew the world worked like this." Samuel didn't explain himself. Explanations were too light for what he was carrying. He set the paper down between them. Let it sit. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling loose metal against the walls. Somewhere, a chain clinked softly, moved by nothing but air. This was the moment stories usually turn dramatic, where forgiveness is asked for, where guilt is confessed loudly enough to feel resolved. That didn't happen. Elena didn't say she forgave him. Samuel didn't ask. Because some truths don't ask for permission before changing the shape of things. What followed wasn't reconciliation. It was adjustment. Samuel took on work that made his days longer and his nights quieter. He rerouted supplies, gave up space, accepted restrictions he could have avoided if he'd stayed silent. Each change was small, almost unremarkable. But together, they formed a life that cost him more than the old one ever had. That's what real accountability looks like. Not a single moment of pain, but a steady inconvenience that never quite goes away. Samuel didn't get relief. He got responsibility. He learned where the floorboards creaked because he slept lighter now. Learned the sound of Elena's steps so he wouldn't startle her. Learned how to leave doors open without offering explanations. There was no grand apology, only consistency. And consistency is harder to fake. Elena watched him closely, not with suspicion, with attention. The kind that comes from knowing promises break easily, but patterns are harder to maintain. She didn't soften right away. She wasn't supposed to. Healing didn't come from hearing the truth spoken out loud. It came from seeing it lived with, day after day. Samuel never spoke about redemption. That word belonged to people who wanted an ending. He understood something else instead. You don't undo harm by feeling bad enough. You undo it by choosing a life that doesn't let you forget. That's why there was no climax, no release, just a quiet shift in how things were done. How space was shared, how power was redistributed without ceremony. This is the part stories often skip, the part after the reveal, when the camera usually fades out, because living with the truth is less dramatic than discovering it. But it's the only part that actually matters. Samuel's past didn't disappear. It followed him in the way he hesitated before speaking. In the way he accepted discomfort without complaint. In the way he no longer reached for his pocket watch to distract himself from time. He didn't ask Elena to move on. He didn't ask her to understand. He only did the one thing left that still had weight. He stayed, and he made sure staying cost him something. Not once, not loudly, but every single day after. Because some debts aren't meant to be paid off. They're meant to be carried, and carrying them is the point. This story doesn't end with applause. There's no moment where everything feels settled. No final scene where the past is erased and everyone walks away lighter. Life doesn't work that way. Samuel and Elena kept moving forward, not because things were fixed, but because standing still hurt more than continuing. Days came and went. The land stayed the same. The wind still cut through the valley at night. Some mornings were quiet, some were heavy. Elena didn't suddenly trust the world again. She didn't wake up one day feeling safe just because the truth had been spoken. Healing didn't arrive like relief. It arrived like work. Slow, uneven, personal. There were moments she chose distance. Moments she chose silence. Moments she chose to be alone even when she didn't have to be. And that was her right. Samuel learned to respect that. He stopped trying to measure progress, stopped looking for signs that he was forgiven. He focused on something simpler, not making things worse. That became his rule. He showed up when he was needed, stepped back when he wasn't. Let time pass without trying to rush it into meaning something comforting. Some evenings, he still sat with his pocket watch open, feeling the seconds move forward whether he wanted them to or not. The difference was, he no longer used it to escape. He let time do what it does best. Carry things forward without explaining them. This isn't a story about being saved. It's about not being abandoned. There's a difference. Being saved means someone pulls you out at the last moment. Not being abandoned means someone stays close enough that you don't disappear. If you've ever been in Elena's place, you know how rare that feels. If you've ever learned to survive by lowering your expectations, by staying quiet, by asking for less than you deserved, then you know how long loneliness can last, even when other people are around. This part is for you. Not the version of you who looks strong now, but the version who once stood still, waiting to see if anyone would notice. Maybe no one did. And maybe that taught you something you never should have had to learn, that you had to take care of yourself because no one else was coming. If that's true, hear this. You didn't fail for surviving that way. You adapted, and you're allowed to adapt again. You don't owe the world forgiveness. You don't owe anyone closure. What you do owe yourself is attention. The kind Samuel learned too late. The kind Elena had to teach herself. Attention to when you're tired, to when you're shrinking, to when silence starts to feel familiar instead of safe. This story isn't asking you to be brave in a dramatic way. It's asking you something quieter. When was the last time you noticed yourself standing alone and chose not to walk past? When was the last time you stayed with your own pain long enough to take it seriously? Because sometimes, the most important rescue doesn't come from someone else. It comes from the moment you stop pretending you don't see yourself anymore. And that moment doesn't look like victory. It looks like staying, even when it's uncomfortable, even when no one claps, even when nothing feels resolved yet. So before this story fades out, ask yourself one thing, not what you've survived, but this. When was the last time you chose not to abandon yourself? And what would change if you did that again tomorrow?